In 1983, the world experienced what we call now as the video game crash of 1983. Japan had a much cooler name for it, which they called the Atari Shock. It was called this because at that point in time, Atari dominated the video game market with their home consoles like the Atari 2600. But then, something really bad happened. They released E.T. No, I'm just kidding. Instead, something far worse happened. A large-scale recession in the video game industry in the United States had just begun. This crash can be attributed to several factors, including market saturation in the number of video game consoles and available games, many of which were of very poor quality, like E.T. People started to get bored of playing Pac-Man and Tetris and started to favor the new personal computer. But then, a small Japanese company named Nintendo had a really good idea and decided to release the Famicom, or as the greasy Americans know it, the NES. The NES did incredibly well and in its lifetime had sold nearly 62 million units worldwide. Meanwhile, another smaller Japanese company named Sega also had a really good idea and decided to release the less catchy and way worse sounding SG-1000. And nobody cared. They released the SG-1000 in Japan the same day as the Famicom and it only sold 1,600,000 units in its first year. In stark contrast, the Famicom sold 500,000 units in its first 2 months. Naturally, Sega was like, shit. So they redesigned the SG-1000 twice to try and build a system to challenge Nintendo's dominance. And thus, the SG-1000 Mark II was born. But it failed to gain any further sales. Sega then tried for a third time and made a Mark III. It was slightly more powerful than the Famicom and was rebranded as the Master System for its worldwide release. But Nintendo had a very elaborate and incredibly evil licensing plan, which kept developers to developing games exclusive to the NES, so Sega basically had no fun games and so no one wanted to buy it. Sega got really angry that Nintendo was making so much dough that they ripped a 16-bit processor from their arcade machines and stuffed it into a home console and named it the Mega Drive. Sega really hated Nintendo at this point, so they designed the Mega Drive to be more mature looking and less like a toy compared to the Famicom to appeal to an older demographic of gamers. However, Nintendo released Super Mario Bros. 3 like a week prior and overshadowed the launch of the Mega Drive. Now, Sega is really angry and decided to make a major push for the Mega Drive in the United States, now rebranded as the admittedly cooler Sega Genesis. Then President of Sega of America Michael Katz decided to implement a bold marketing strategy for a nationwide push of the Genesis. Firstly, he made sure everyone knew that the Genesis had 16 bits, which is 2 times more the amount of bits than the NES had, by publicly shaming them in multiple marketing campaigns, most notably being the famous Sega Does What Nintendo Don't campaign.
Genesis does
16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free. What Nintendo?
Then, he made the Japanese headquarters pay celebrities for their naming rights for games like Pat Riley Basketball and Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. But this still wasn't enough. The Genesis still struggled in the United States against Nintendo and only sold about 500,000 units by mid-1990. Reminder that Nintendo had released Super Mario Bros. 3 in February of 1990, so they really weren't affected by the Genesis at all. So Sega's president at the time, Heio Nakayama, wanted the company to develop an iconic mascot and build a game around it as a means to challenge Nintendo's Mario. Company artist Naoto Oshima came up with the concept of Sonic the Hedgehog, a fast anthropomorphic character with an attitude that would appeal to teenagers and matched Sega's bold marketing campaign of appealing to a more mature demographic. They also incorporated the blue color of Sega's logo, and Yuji Naka developed a game for Sonic to showcase the character as well as the graphics along with the processing speed of the Genesis. Anyway, remember Michael Katz? Yeah, Sega fired him and replaced him with Tom Kalinske as Sega of America's new CEO mid-1990. Although it was harsh, Sega made the right move as Kalinske developed a new strategy for Sega with 4 key decisions. Firstly, he cut the price of the Genesis from $189 to only $149. Secondly, he continued the same aggressive marketing campaigns to publicly shame Nintendo. Then Kalinske pushed hard for developers like EA to create games on the Genesis that Americans would like way more, like Madden. Finally, Kalinske insisted on making Sonic the bundled game on the system following its release in June of 1991. And finally, Sega had a legitimate shot at Nintendo. While all this was happening, Nintendo was preparing to launch a super version of their very successful NES. Again, very poorly named the SNES. However, it was far too late. Under Kalinske, Sega made its first gain on Nintendo in the US market. Families saw that the Genesis bundled with Sonic the Hedgehog was only $149, whereas the SNES had a planned price tag of $199. This led to families to choosing the financially and obvious answer to purchase the Genesis instead of waiting for the SNES. Now Nintendo was angry and was forced to publicly acknowledge that it was no longer in the dominant position in the console market by 1992. A year into the SNES's release, the SNES's price was lowered to $149 to match the Genesis, to which Sega said, "Nice try," and reduced the Genesis further to $129. Although the SNES outsold the Genesis in the US in 1992, the Genesis still had a far larger install base. And then a new problem was thrown into the mix. Street Fighter II had become so popular that it led to the growth of the fighting game genre, and Mortal Kombat was released to arcades in 1992. Due to the Mortal Kombat's sheer volume of violence, it became extremely popular, and so Sega and Nintendo were both like, shit, I need that. However, Nintendo, like the little baby company they were, had issues with the game's violence and instead licensed a clean version of the game for the SNES. They replaced the blood splatter with sweat and removed the infamous fatalities. Sega also licensed this censored version of the game for the Genesis, but Sega was like way cooler and players could enter a cheat code that reverted the game back to its original arcade version. Both home versions were released in September and the Genesis version was way more popular with 3 to 5 times more sales than the SNES counterpart. Sega had been outperforming Nintendo in 1993, but like many college students, still carried a large amount of corporate debt, while Nintendo remained debt-free from having a more dominant position in the worldwide market. And thus, although it was a close and exciting war, Nintendo beat Sega, winning the 16-bit console war. And Nintendo could finally rest easy.